Alastair Crooke, prominent, renowned expert on the international relations and geostrategic and geofinancial issues. Alastair, thank you very much for accepting to give this short talk to Conflux Center. And of course I will ask you immediately the main issue which is on top of everyone's mind, where we are heading. We hear a lot about emerging paradigm, changing balance of power, moving from unipolar to polycentric world. But what all this is about?
I think that what we're seeing at this time, and which is quite worrying, is the sense that the polarization that we saw taking place first in America and is not so apparent but still in Europe, but that polarization has, instead of coming to some sort of agreement, some sort of understanding, is now becoming a wider polarization. And it's a polarization that's now reached the Security Council. You can see that the feeling at the Security Council and the sense of the Security Council now reflects a great bitterness and a hostility of language. And I know from experience that when I was in the European Union at the time of the Iraq War, before the Iraq War, that the hatred that was existing between France and Britain at that time paralyzed everything, paralyzed not only the international politics, but sort of sank down and filtered out throughout the whole European Union and became impossible to do business. And I rather fear that what we're seeing is that. The language, the feeling of incipient conflict with Russia and also with China and Iran and of course North Korea waiting in the background means that we have reaching a period of huge uncertainty on the political front, just as we're finding that there is a period of volatility and change taking place in the financial field. And the two are coming together simultaneously and can portend really major shifts that are taking place. But this is becoming, I think, going to become a really crucial year for all of us in terms of how we manage this year, whether we can manage it. When I say manage it, I mean we're seeing one by one all of the structures, whether they're domestic American structure, Congress doesn't work, departments of state in America are at odds with each other. One says they accept the president's policy, another will go and contradict the president the next day. New tweets come out. The unitive American state no longer exists. It is breaking up and it is at war with itself. And now that war has moved to the international front at the Security Council. So that is going to be paralyzed and no longer be able to act in a concerted and unitive way. And I think that what we are seeing very much is a shift in American policy towards something much more aggressive. We've seen these three statements that are policy statements by the US government now. And the statements have been progressively more worrying, if you like, in terms of the consequences. The first was just simply a restatement of earlier policy that they didn't like Russia and China being rivals and competitors, and America wanted to retain the primacy. Then it was a very sharp change in gear towards calling Russia and China revisionist powers. Now, the term revisionist powers, which probably doesn't mean much to most people, but in the Western theoretical language means a state which will use military force to overthrow the status quo, the international order. Will use it. In other words, it's calling them seditionists who will use violence to overturn the Lich order. And then we then had a third one which said, while the US has been, carefully tending the global world for the best interests of everybody, as they claim, then we have had all of these powers, Russia and China, developing new weapons and leaving the United States behind, and now America must assert an even greater dominance in military power. Huge increases in expenditure and new weapons. New submarines, complete new missile systems, and new nuclear weapons. It's an extraordinary, invitation to an arms race and therefore greater confrontation, and language couched in language which is much more aggressive than even the Cold War. And every day you see more demonization of Russia and China throughout the paper. The focus, I think, is going to be, you mentioned about it, where it is, the focus. There are divisions, deep divisions in the United States, but there's one thing that unites the Democrats and the Republicans and the public, is China. China is an economic threat, China as an incipient military threat, and the desire to cut China down to size. Firstly, economically, because they don't want a military war with China, by putting tariffs on. Treasury has a list less long of complaints under the World Trade Organization against China, which it says it's going to pursue. The President seems to be very keen on this, even though his Treasury Secretary is less keen, and the Economic Secretary, Mr. Cohen, is not happy about this. But I think we will see that. And then we will see Russia and Iran under financial sanctions. Why? Not because they are threatening America as such, but they threaten America's domination financially as much as in terms of military. And they threaten America's financial well-being because if they succeed in establishing a large trading area in Eurasia and Asia, and you add in the BRICS to it, that's half the world's population. And if half the global population tend to stop using the dollars and use their own currencies and swap currencies amongst themselves and not go through the New York banks, then America has a whole lot of fiat dollars, billions and trillions of them, that people are not holding so firmly. And that'll make it extremely difficult for them to maintain their debt at more than 20 trillion and to pay their deficits as Trump starts in this big exercise of military spending, of infrastructure spending, of spending and budget deficits.
You mentioned the narrative and language. There are certainly issues and problems in the relationship, especially between US and China and also US and Russia, and between other important international players. But you emphasize the importance of language and narrative. Is it possible that we are in a situation where the problems which exist could be overcome, could be bridgeable, if it wasn't for this kind of a very hostile narrative and language which dominates the public discourse?
I think it's absolutely right. And always the first step towards being able to remove yourself from one of these situations is to try and de-escalate the language and agree not to use this language against each other and to just have a pause and then perhaps to start talking. But de-escalating the language has always been the first step in sort of conflict resolution, to stop calling each other names, to stop calling each other, you can criticize each other, but you don't have to use this extreme and this hyperbolic language and this emotional language which fires up your populations against a neighboring state. And it also helps if you stop killing the other side. And we've seen just recently something that had never happened during the Cold War, which is that American Air Force have killed Russian servicemen in Syria on the east side of the Euphrates. The Russians are very passionate about the killing of their servicemen in this case. There weren't as many as been suggested in the press, but nonetheless it's a very symbolic shift in a very unfortunate direction, that you have for the first time service people of Russia being killed at the same time the language is going up step by step by step against Russia and against China. America's in a different position with China because it's a bit cautious. It doesn't want to enter into any conflict with China. But Russia is, because of the history of the allegations about its involvement, the unfounded allegations about its involvement in the American elections, it's still a very sensitive issue in the West. It's a historical issue. So it's easier to escalate the language against Russia.
Perceptions and misperceptions, they can lead to a conflict, even when there is no real cause for a conflict. If there are misperceptions about the objectives, determination, capability of other side, that could very easily mislead someone into entering a conflict. Are we facing this situation on both sides of this polarized, increasingly polarized world, where maybe the US is having misperceptions about the intentions and the determination and capacity of Russia and China and the others, and whether maybe China especially is having misperception about the will of the status quo powers to fight to maintain the status quo?
I think that the misperceptions that you describe are deliberate and intentional misperceptions. I mean, conceived deliberately and with premeditation to create this tension, because as you recall, and I know also, it was very clear then when Mr. Trump came into office, there was a readiness in Russia to welcome him more so than there was amongst most European countries. They were prepared to take Trump on it. I'm not talking about collusion. There was no collusion, but you know, in any case, people have preferences and look forward. And there were good reasons for thinking that there could be a relationship between President Trump and President Putin that would diminish these problems, and that these could be generated through a discussion between the two presidents. But what happened was a major intervention by what we call the deep state, the establishment mostly of the intelligence and security services in America, that deliberately wanted to use Russia as a means to delegitimize the President of the United States and remove him from office, if it was possible. Have him impeached or indicted for breach of the law in respect to blocking the legal processes. So it was deliberate. And those voices calling those who were, there's a very famous professor like Stephen Cohen, who has a huge experience of Russia and is knowledgeable. He's been dealing with Russia for 50 years and speaks Russia and has lived in Russia, and was an influence during the periods of earlier, during Reagan's period and elsewhere. And I remember him saying, you know, during the time of Reagan, which was the Cold War period, he said there was real support for détente with Russia. People would listen in Congress, the think tanks, in academia. There was a constituency there. And it was one so that people actually talked and the subject was discussion. He says, now there's me and two others. And we have no ability to influence in Washington whatsoever. We are Putin's poodles. speaking on his trolls for Putin are not completely discredited. This is the worst, he said, it's ever been in this period. So I think when you hear that from someone who is so careful and so very precise in his language and his description of Russia and his attempt to set some understanding. When you see Oliver Stone and produced a 4-hour after 4 hours of documentary on President Putin to try and explain him and understand, which has been completely, if you like, ignored and criticized in the West, you know, it's not just a problem of simple misunderstandings and misperceptions that can be corrected. This is something much more profound. This is a doctrinal, ideological misconception.
The US-Russia relationship, or US-Soviet Union relationship, it was always characterized, whenever we had the detente and the relaxation and improvement in their bilateral relationship, it was always coming from the top. It was always a summit, you know, between the leaders of two countries, and then we'll go and we'll spill over to other levels of power in both countries. But it seems that the way to manage this very important, crucial relationship for everyone was always at the summit level. But now, not only since President Trump came to power, but even during the last few years of President Obama presidency, there were no proper summits between the leaders. Is that something which leads to this situation where we are now, full of lack of trust and suspicion and threats, at least from outside?
Absolutely, and particularly in this case, where both the presidents wanted to meet and have been undermined in their ability to meet precisely by these allegations and the information war that is waged against President Trump, that he is, I think they were calling him, you know, that he was Mr. Putin's agent, effectively, in the White House, that he was only elected because of Mr. Putin, and he was therefore somehow not loyal to America any longer. Very severe allegations against the president because there were certain people in the background. And let's be clear, I mean, we're talking about people like John Brennan, the former head of CIA, and Mr. Clapper, who did not want to see détente with Russia because they believed it was not in America's interest and that they understood America's interest better than the elected President of the United States understood what was America's interest in this period. This is a very major constitutional change. I mean, this is internal war intended to stop him being able to talk or meet with Mr. Putin and to put a wedge in that process. I think it is an attempt. And really it goes back to Obama because, in a sense, Obama had bet on Medvedev, and they thought Medvedev could be brought into the Western sphere. And when it turned out that Medvedev was not going to have the second term and Putin was going to run in the second term, then for Obama it was finished. And he turned and it became antagonistic to Putin personally because it felt Obama seemed to feel that this had finished his initiative, that Putin had deliberately undermined the American initiative by taking, as he saw it, the presidency away from Medvedev, who could have almost come into the Western sphere.
Alastair, thank you very much for being guest of Conflux Center. Thank you for sharing your vast experience, deep analysis and knowledge with us and our viewers. Thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting me here.
Thank
I
you.
much enjoyed it.
Thank you, Alastair.